Grace Mitchell wasn't nervous about flying. Unlike many of her friends, she found air travel peaceful, almost meditative. A 29-year-old middle school teacher from Charleston, South Carolina, she had flown dozens of times over the years. This particular flight, a small regional aircraft heading from Key West back home, was supposed to be the calm end to a relaxing 5-day trip visiting her mother. Nothing more than a routine hop across Florida and Georgia. The plane had about 16 passengers, mostly older couples and a few solo travelers. Grace sat in seat 4A, by the window, her backpack tucked beneath the seat in front of her. She wore simple jeans, a loose cardigan, and headphones. As the plane rolled down the runway and lifted into the sky, she closed her eyes briefly, enjoying the soft tug of gravity releasing her from the earth. The sky was beautiful that morning, a soft blue canvas, feathered with streaks of white. From her window, she could see the ocean glimmering like glass beneath them. The hum of the engine was steady and soothing. Flight attendants walked the aisle, smiling and offering water bottles and small packets of peanuts. Grace took a bottle, thanked the attendant, and returned to her podcasts, some true crime story that seemed miles away from the peace surrounding her. About 40 minutes into the flight, the pilot's voice crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently flying at 9,000 feet, he began. Weather looks good all the way up to Charleston. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the view." Something about his voice made Grace glance up. It was slow, drawn out, slightly slurred. She looked toward the other passengers. No one else seemed to notice. They sipped drinks, read magazines, scrolled through their phones. Maybe she'd imagined it. Minutes passed. Then another announcement came. But it wasn't an announcement. It was noise. A distorted, garbled sound echoed through the speaker, like someone had pressed the mic button but didn't know what to say. It lingered awkwardly, then cut off with a crackle. Grace pulled off her headphones, frowning. That didn't sound right. A moment later, something even stranger happened. A young woman, one of the flight attendants, rushed up the aisle from the cockpit. Her normally composed expression was visibly shaken. She leaned into the intercom near the front of the plane and spoke, her voice tight with urgency. "Is there anyone on board with flight experience? Any pilots?" Passengers stirred in their seats. One man halfway back lifted his head, looking confused. Another woman clutched her husband's arm. Grace's pulse quickened. "Is anyone here a licensed pilot? Please raise your hand." Silence. No one moved. Grace's eyes darted around. A man in business clothes looked down at his shoes. A teenage boy took out his earbuds. But no one raised a hand. No one claimed any experience. The flight attendant stepped into the aisle again, visibly pale. Grace's heart started pounding in her chest. She stood up halfway in her seat. "I'm not a pilot," she said aloud, her voice quivering slightly. "But I've taken lessons. I used to fly Cessnas years ago. I never got certified." The flight attendant locked eyes with her, almost desperately. "Can you help?" she asked. Grace hesitated. She hadn't touched a flight control in nearly 8 years. Her knowledge was buried beneath lesson plans and grading rubrics. Dusty memories of dials and runway landings in small aircraft under perfect conditions. But what choice did she have? Someone had to act. "I'll try," Grace said. The flight attendant reached for her hand, steadying her. "Come with me." Grace stepped into the aisle, every eye in the cabin following her. She could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken question trembling in the air. Who is she to save us? She followed the flight attendant toward the cockpit. The door was ajar. A strange, high-pitched warning tone echoed from inside. Grace peered through. The pilot slumped in the chair, unconscious. His arms hung limp, head tilted awkwardly against the side window. A sickly pale hue colored his face. The control panel blinked with unfamiliar lights, buttons, ages, and warnings that Grace had never seen before. This wasn't a tiny Cessna with one simple yoke. This was a full regional aircraft. A much bigger machine. She froze. The flight attendant nudged her gently. "They're trying to reach us on the radio. Please just talk to them." Grace nodded. Her legs shook as she stepped into the cockpit and sat in the co-pilot's seat. She grabbed the headset and slid it over her ears. Her fingers trembled. "Hello?" she said into the mic. My name is Grace Mitchell. The pilot is unconscious. I'm just a passenger." A few seconds of silence passed. Then, a calm, professional voice responded. "Copy that, Grace. This is Miami Center. We're going to get you through this. You are not alone." For the first time since the nightmare began, a flicker of hope returned. But deep inside, Grace knew something. Terrifying. This wasn't going to be easy. The plane was in her hands now, and she was still just a passenger. A thick, uncomfortable silence had spread through the narrow cabin like a creeping fog. The question still echoed in everyone's mind. Is there anyone here who can fly a plane? But no hands rose. No voices answered. People looked around. Helplessly, some hoping for a hero to appear out of nowhere, others paralyzed by disbelief. The flight attendant, Megan, tried to stay composed, but her voice betrayed her panic. She returned from the cockpit, trembling. "The pilot is completely unresponsive," she said quietly to no one in particular. "I couldn't wake him. He's not moving." Her words weren't meant for everyone, but the passengers heard them. Some began whispering, others grew pale. An elderly man took off his glasses and closed his eyes. A mother clutched her daughter's hand. The mood on board had shifted from casual travel to silent dread. In seat 4A, Grace's mind raced. She kept replaying the moment she saw the pilot. Slumped over, limp, lifeless. A part of her kept hoping it was some kind of dream, but she knew better. The voice on the radio had been real. The panic in the attendant's eyes was real. And the plane was still flying on autopilot for now. But without a conscious pilot, time was ticking down. Years ago, when she was just out of college, Grace had taken flying lessons for fun. Her instructor had said she had natural instincts. But life had gotten in the way. Bills, teaching, family obligations. All those dreams of solo flights had drifted to the background. Her license had never been completed. Her last flight? Over 8 years ago. But right now, in a sky full of strangers, she seemed to be the only one with any kind of flight experience at all. She stood up again, more confidently this time. "I'm not a pilot," she said louder, addressing the cabin. "But I've flown before. Small planes. I know some of the basics." Megan rushed to her side. "Please," she said, relief washing over her face. "Just come up and talk to air traffic control. They're asking for anyone with experience." As Grace followed Megan down the narrow aisle, she could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze pressing into her back. Some looked hopeful, others confused. One woman clasped her hands together in prayer. The pressure was suffocating. They reached the cockpit. The pilot hadn't moved. The space felt even smaller now. Blinking lights surrounded them. Warning tones chimed at intervals, some low and steady, others sharp and urgent. Grace climbed carefully into the right seat, her mind scanning old lessons. Yoke, rudder pedals, throttle, altitude, heading indicator. Some instruments looked familiar. Others DIDN, single quotes T. Megan handed her the headset, then reached over and pressed the push-to-talk button on the console. "This is Grace Mitchell," she said into the mic. "I'm a passenger. The pilot's unconscious. I have limited flying experience, but I'll do my best." A short pause. And a calm voice replied, Copy that, Grace. This is Miami Center. We're going to stay with you. Do not worry. You're not alone up there. Grace exhaled slowly. Is the aircraft on autopilot? The controller asked. Grace scanned the panel. She spotted the switch labeled autopilot. It was lit. She confirmed it. Okay, good, the controller said. We'll keep you steady for now. We're bringing in a flight instructor to walk you through what's next. The voice switched. Channels. For a moment, Grace was left in silence. Her hands hovered over the yoke. The pilot groaned faintly, but didn't wake. Megan stood beside her, breathing hard. Is it working? Are they helping? They're getting someone, Grace said. She turned to look at Megan. How much fuel do we have? Megan hesitated. I don't know. I can try to find out. Grace nodded, then turned back to the panel. She could feel every heartbeat in her fingertips. She had never imagined this moment. All those afternoons in the flight simulator had seemed like a hobby. Now, they were the only reason this plane had a chance. A new voice came over the radio. Grace, this is Tom Hadley. I'm a certified flight instructor. I've got experience with this aircraft model. We're going to land you safely, okay? Okay, Grace replied. I'm listening. First thing, deep breath. Then check your attitude indicator. That's the circular display with the miniature airplane in the middle. She found it. The plane was level. Good. Now I want you to place your hands on the yoke lightly. Keep your feet off the rudder pedals, unless I say so. We'll guide you step by step. Grace's hands followed the instructions automatically. Her brain was buzzing, but her movements were steady. You're doing great, Tom's voice said behind her. Megan whispered, everyone's counting on you. Grace nodded. She knew that already. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't a captain. She wasn't trained for emergencies. She was a teacher, a daughter, a passenger. But in the sky above Florida, none of that mattered anymore. Grace sat frozen in the co-pilot's seat. The cockpit surrounded her with blinking buttons, unfamiliar switches, and high-pitched alerts that seemed to scream louder with every passing second. She had sat in a cockpit before, but never like this. This wasn't a controlled lesson in a single-engine Cessna 172 on a sunny Sunday afternoon. This was a live aircraft, mid-air, full of passengers, and no functioning pilot. The man meant to fly this plane was still unconscious. His chest rose and fell weakly, a cold sweat glistening on his forehead. A faint groan escaped his lips, but his eyes remained shut. The control panel was far more complex than anything Grace had touched before. While many of the basic flight principles were universal, this aircraft had a host of avionics systems she didn't recognize. It was intimidating, no, terrifying. But she reminded herself of one thing. She wasn't alone. A flight controller and an instructor were both on the radio, and if she could just listen, breathe, and focus, maybe, just maybe, she could do this. Tom Hadley's voice came through again, calm and focused. Grace, we're going to start with orientation. You're doing great. Keep that headset on and stay with me. Okay, she whispered. Look at your main panel. Center screen. You'll see the attitude indicator artificial horizon. That's our reference. She found it, just as he described. The small plane icon on the screen floated slightly tilted, the horizon line steady. You're flying level right now. Autopilot engaged. Good. Next, I need you to confirm your heading. See the compass dial just below? Heading 305, she said, heart thumping. Perfect. You're holding straight and level. Now let's check altitude. Look for your altimeter. Reading 9,200 feet, she confirmed. Excellent. Now I want you to get a feel for the controls. Gently rest your right hand on the yoke. Light grip. Just feel it respond. She placed her hand on the yoke and gently nudged it to the left. The aircraft barely tilted. Nice work, Tom encouraged. Now back to center. Good. Don't overcorrect. Your instincts are solid. Grace's breathing steadied slightly. The yoke didn't feel foreign, just unfamiliar. Like picking up a guitar after years away. The muscle memory hadn't left. It was just buried beneath years of inaction and doubt. Tom continued. Autopilot is on, so the system is doing the flying. But at some point, you'll need to take over. We'll guide you into a descent when the time comes. Grace glanced over at the pilot again. His breathing remained shallow, his head limp. She reached out to check his pulse, like she'd seen in first aid classes. It was there weak, but steady. She pressed the intercom button and called out, "We need medical help ready on the ground." The pilot has a pulse, but is unresponsive. Tom's voice returned quickly. Roger that. Emergency teams are already en route to the airstrip. You won't be landing at your original destination. We're diverting you to a closer regional airport with a longer runway and emergency crews. Okay, she said softly. How long do I have? You've got about 45 minutes of flight time at current speed and altitude, he answered. Plenty of time. We're going to take it step by step. Behind her, Megan, the flight attendant, hovered silently. She handed Grace a bottle of water, her eyes wide with a strange mix of fear and admiration. Everyone's calm back there, for now, she whispered. Grace nodded. The weight of those words hit her like a punch. Everyone back there, dozens of strangers, families, children, were relying on her. She didn't know their names, their stories, or even their faces. But they were trusting her, a schoolteacher with old flying lessons, to bring them home. Grace, Tom said again, we're going to test disengaging autopilot briefly, just so you can feel manual control. Nothing sudden? Ready? She hesitated. Her hands were already damp with sweat. But she took a deep breath and replied, I'm ready. Disengage autopilot switch. She flicked the switch. Immediately, the plane responded. It dipped slightly to the right. Alarms beeped. Altitude started fluctuating. Grace quickly corrected, gripping the yoke tighter and gently leveling the wings. You've got control, Tom said calmly. Hold it steady. You're doing fine. The aircraft leveled out. Grace could feel her heart in her throat, but the panic didn't consume her this time. Her fingers found their rhythm. Her instincts awakened. She wasn't perfect, but she was learning. Re-engage autopilot, Tom instructed. She flipped the switch back, and the plane stabilized on its original path. That was it, he said. Now you know what to expect. Grace sat back for a second, letting the tension roll off her shoulders. Megan leaned in. You were amazing. Grace shook her head. I was scared out of my mind. But you did it anyway, Megan said. That's what matters. Over the next 10 minutes, Grace worked with Tom to review key procedures. Altitude control, throttle management, flap deployment, gear operation. Each step felt like trying to remember a dream, but it came back, little by little. Her brain, desperate to survive, was pulling every lesson from the archives of her past. Grace, Tom finally said, we're almost ready to begin descent. We've got a clear runway for you at Daytona Regional. All you have to do is follow my lead. Grace looked out the windshield. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, but somewhere out there, the earth was waiting. A runway, a crowd, and maybe, just maybe, a safe landing. Her hands tightened on the yoke. Okay, she said, voice firm. Let's land this thing. Grace stared through the cockpit window, eyes squinting into the endless sky ahead. Far below, clouds drifted like soft pillows, masking the earth and the runway that waited somewhere underneath. Her palms still trembled, but her grip on the yoke was steady. The autopilot hummed softly, maintaining altitude for now. But that would change soon. The voice in her ear, Tom Hadley, was her lifeline, now the calm in the storm. "Grace," Tom said gently, "we're about 30 miles out from Daytona Regional. We'll start your descent shortly. First, a few checks." "Okay," she replied, exhaling slowly. "I'm ready." Behind her, the flight attendant whispered updates from the cabin. The passengers were still quiet, holding their breath, watching. Some had texted loved ones. A few silently prayed. Others stared forward in stunned silence, clinging to hope that Grace, this stranger, this teacher, would defy gravity and guide them home. Tom's voice returned. "Let's run a pre-descent checklist. First, fuel status." Grace located the fuel gauge, studying the dials. "Left tank just under half. Right tank about the same. Copy that. Plenty for landing. Next, check altimeter. 9,100 feet. Good. Start reducing throttle slowly. Bring it back to 70%. She slid the throttle back gently. The hum of the engine lowered. The aircraft responded with a slight dip. "You're doing great," Tom assured her. "We'll descend in stages. I'm going to give you new altitudes. Just keep the nose level as we reduce power." Grace followed the steps carefully. The aircraft began to drop gradually. No sudden movement, just a gentle sink in altitude. Her ears popped as the pressure adjusted. Tom's voice was steady. "This is where it gets a little more hands-on. Once we reach 3,000 feet, you'll take full control. Autopilot's good, but it won't land for you." "Understood, Grace," replied. Megan spoke up. "Medical team confirmed. They'll be waiting on the tarmac." Grace gave a quick nod. She looked over at the unconscious pilot again. He hadn't moved in over an hour. His color was still pale, but his breathing had stabilized. It was strange to think he might owe his life to a passenger he'd never spoken to. Approaching 7,000, Grace said aloud, watching the instruments. Tom replied, "Perfect. You're flying better than some of my students." A thin, involuntary laugh escaped her lips. It helped release the tension. "That's a terrifying compliment," she joked. "Sometimes terror sharpens skill," he replied, with a chuckle of his own. "Now listen carefully. When we get to 3,000 feet, disengage. Autopilot. You'll line up with runway 25. It's straight ahead. You should see land now." Grace leaned forward. The clouds had thinned. A thin strip of coast appeared below, and just beyond it, a long stretch of concrete, her target. "I see it," she said. "That's your runway. Start visual alignment. Reduce speed gradually. Let's aim for a clean approach." Her hands moved methodically. She adjusted throttle again, watching her vertical speed indicator carefully. The descent was smooth, slower now. The radio cracked with a new voice. "Daytona Tower. November 618, we've got you. Emergency response is standing by. Winds 5 knots from the west. You are cleared for final approach. Welcome home." Grace blinked. She hadn't expected such warmth from a voice she didn't know. The word home hit deep. Tom's voice returned. "All right, Grace, this is it. Disengage autopilot." She flipped the switch. The aircraft jolted slightly. The yoke twitched in her hands as the plane swayed left, then right. She corrected quickly, gently easing it back on course. "Wings level. Keep your nose steady." "You're doing great," Tom said, reassuringly. "Lower your flaps 10 degrees. Slow descent." Grace reached for the flap lever and adjusted. The aircraft responded, pitching slightly as speed reduced. In the cabin, some passengers were crying softly. One man stood to record the landing, only to be told to sit back down. Every face was trained on the windows now, waiting, watching, hoping. "Flaps 20. Gear down," Tom instructed. The landing gear lever felt heavier than she expected. She pulled it. A loud thunk echoed under the plane. Green lights confirmed. Gear down and locked. Altitude 1,800, she called out. Perfect. Maintain glide path. That runway's coming fast. Grace narrowed her focus. The runway loomed larger now, lined with flashing lights. Her breathing slowed. Her thoughts quieted. She wasn't thinking about failure anymore. She was in the moment, responding. Correcting, guiding. Throttle back to 40%. Tom said, done, double quotes, flaps to 30. Keep it smooth. Done. Keep descending, nice and steady. You're nearly there. Grace's heart pounded. Her hands were locked on the yoke, her eyes fixed on the numbers and the strip of earth rushing up toward them. She could feel the aircraft getting heavier as it descended. The yoke responded differently. There was less forgiveness. It demanded precision, but she was ready. Final descent, Tom said softly. Bring her home, Grace. The nose of the aircraft pointed slightly downward as Grace began her final descent. Through the windshield, the runway grew larger with each passing second, a narrow stretch of concrete surrounded by flashing lights and emergency vehicles waiting like silent sentinels. Her hands trembled slightly on the yoke, but she kept her grip firm. There was no turning back now. Altitude 1,200, she called out over the headset. Looking good, Tom replied. Stay on glide slope. Runway's right ahead. You're? Lined up perfectly. Behind her, the cabin was eerily silent. Not a single voice spoke. Passengers held hands, clutched their seats, whispered quiet prayers, or simply stared forward, wide-eyed. From their perspective, the plane was flying straight into uncertainty, guided not by a trained pilot, but by one of their own. In the cockpit, every second felt like a lifetime. Alarms chirped, occasionally alerts about altitude changes and throttle warnings, but Tom calmly told her which ones to ignore and which to adjust for. Each instruction was simple but vital. Ease back on the throttle, Grace. Let the plane descend under its own weight. She did so carefully. The aircraft dipped lower. The edges of the runway sharpened in her view. She was now less than a minute from attempting something she'd never done in this type of aircraft. Land it manually. Flaps full. Final configuration. She pushed the lever. The plane slowed further. The nose pitched slightly, and she quickly trimmed it, trying to keep the descent stable. Altitude 600 feet, she reported, voice more controlled than she felt. You're golden, Grace, said Tom. Keep her centered. You've got this. The plane glided down, eerily smooth. Grace felt the rumble of the landing gear beneath her, the weight of the aircraft shifting as it prepared for touchdown. Throttle to idle. She pushed the throttle forward gently until it reached idle. The engines quieted and the runway stretched. Toward her like a final test, now flare at 20 feet. She remembered this from her old lessons. As the plane approached the ground, she had to gently pull the nose up flare so the rear wheels touched down first. Timing it right was crucial. Too early, and the plane could stall. Too late, and it would slam hard into the ground. The runway rushed beneath them now. 50 feet, Tom said, his voice tight with focus. 30 feet, 20, flare. Grace pulled back on the yoke. The plane's nose lifted. The aircraft hovered for a brief, breathless moment. Then the rear wheels made contact with a thud. The plane bounced upward again, too fast. Passengers screamed. Alarms blared. Grace held steady, fighting instinct, fighting panic. Hold the yoke steady, Tom shouted. Let her settle. She didn't pull more. She didn't fight it. The plane touched down again, this time harder, and stayed on the runway. The tires squealed. The cabin rocked. Brake! Tom called out. Grace slammed her feet on the brake pedals, applying firm but steady pressure. The aircraft rumbled and shuddered, skidding slightly to the left. She corrected. With the rudder, heart pounding, the runway raced by, but it was slowing. The emergency vehicles at the far end loomed closer, but didn't seem as terrifying now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the aircraft rolled to a slow, crawling stop, dead silence. Then a burst of applause erupted from the cabin. Crying, clapping, cheering, raw emotions spilled out behind her. People were sobbing in relief, hugging strangers, gasping in disbelief. That Megan placed a hand on Grace's shoulder, eyes glistening with tears. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Grace sat motionless for a moment, staring at the now still runway ahead. The shaking started suddenly. Her hands, her arms, her legs. Everything that had been held together by adrenaline began to unravel. Tom's voice returned, gentler now. "Grace, that was incredible. You saved lives today. Emergency crews are approaching. Stay seated until they get you out." She nodded slowly, her voice caught in her throat. She looked at the unconscious pilot. He was still breathing, still alive. He owed his life to her. So did everyone behind her. Through the window, red and white flashing lights swarmed toward the aircraft. EMTs jumped out, rushing toward the cabin door. A man in a yellow vest and headset motioned frantically, waving others over. Within seconds, emergency responders boarded the plane. Medics rushed to the pilot first, checking his vitals and preparing to move him safely. A second team approached Grace. "Are you okay, Mom?" One asked. She nodded slowly, still gripping the yoke. Her hands wouldn't let go. Another rescuer gently pried her fingers free. "You did something remarkable," he said. "You can let go now." She blinked, and tears rolled down her cheeks. She stood, her legs barely supporting her. Applause from the passengers rang out again as she stepped into the aisle. Everyone rose. Many were crying. Some reached for her hand. Others simply whispered, "Thank you." Grace walked slowly toward the back of the aircraft, guided by a medic. Outside, cameras had already begun rolling. Fire trucks stood idle now, lights still flashing. The sun glinted off the windows of the plane that, against all odds, had landed safely. She turned once to look at the aircraft. Not long ago, she had boarded it as just another passenger. Now, she had landed it and saved every soul on board. The moment Grace stepped onto the tarmac, the world changed. The air outside felt thicker, heavier, as if the weight of what she'd just done was finally catching up to her. Sirens wailed softly in the distance, drowned out by applause and cheers. Erupting from the terminal windows, first responders surrounded the aircraft. Lights flashed. Cameras clicked. Reporters were already gathering behind security lines, shouting questions she couldn't hear. But all Grace could focus on was the overwhelming rush of emotion surging through her. She was safe. They were safe. She had landed a plane. Paramedics rushed the unconscious pilot to a waiting ambulance. Grace watched, still dazed, as they worked on him. He had stabilized, she was told. Oxygen, 4 fluids, and rapid medical response gave him a fighting chance. The image of him slumped over the controls would haunt her for a long time, but she was comforted knowing he might recover. Passengers began to disembark slowly. Some limped from shock. Others stopped to kneel and kiss the ground. Several hugged each other as if they'd been lifelong friends. When they spotted Grace, they burst into spontaneous applause again, some with tears streaming down their faces. "You saved my family," a man said, wrapping her in a sudden hug. You're a miracle." A young girl no more than 8 stepped forward and handed Grace a small stuffed rabbit. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was really scared." Grace dropped to one knee, tears in her own eyes now. "So was I," she replied. Megan, the flight attendant, was still holding back emotion, mascara streaking her cheeks. She walked up to Grace, hugged her tightly, and whispered, "You are never just a passenger." Within minutes, authorities ushered Grace into a private section of the terminal. A paramedic checked her pulse, asked about injuries. She said she felt fine, shaken, exhausted, numb but fine. Her vitals were normal. Still, they insisted she sit down and drink water. Officials from the FAA, the airline, and the local police arrived one after another. They all wanted statements, reports, explanations. For the first time, Grace realized the scale of what had happened. She wasn't just a woman who'd survived a flight. She was a civilian who had taken control of a commercial aircraft and landed it with zero formal certification. And somehow, everyone had walked away. A federal investigator sat across from her with a clipboard. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I've been in aviation for over 20 years. What you just did, most trained pilots would have struggled with that." "I didn't have a choice," she murmured. He nodded. "That's what makes it even more extraordinary." The questions continued. How much training had she completed? What systems had she used? What commands had she followed? Grace answered everything she could remember, all while trying to process it herself. Reporters waited just beyond the doors. The airline's PR manager entered and gently asked if she'd be comfortable doing a press statement later. Grace shook her head. "Not now," she said. "Maybe not ever." Despite her protests, her name was already trending online. Grace the passenger pilot. Teacher turns hero. Woman lands plane after pilot collapse. The headlines were multiplying. Cell phone videos captured snippets of the cabin. Her voice on the intercom, the moment of touchdown. The screams of relief. News anchors called her a national hero, but Grace didn't feel like one. She felt tired, deeply tired. Her body was coming down from the adrenaline high, and now, with the buzz fading, came the crashing weight of reality. She hadn't even cried yet, not fully. Not the kind of crying that empties the soul. That would come later. An airline representative returned with a tablet in hand. The FIA would like to schedule a debrief. They'll also be recommending you for a formal civilian award for bravery. Grace blinked. "I didn't do it for an award." "We know," he said. "That's why you deserve one." She was given a hotel room to rest, her belongings gathered from the aircraft. The airline offered her the first-class flight home the next morning, but she quietly declined. Driving felt safer now, more grounded, more human. That night, in her hotel room, Grace sat by the window staring at the stars. The sky didn't look peaceful anymore. It looked vast, intimidating, eternal. She replayed the landing over in her mind, every twitch of the controls, every word Tom Hadley had said, every terrified glance Megan had given her. Every second she'd kept herself from breaking down, because she knew that panic would cost lives. Her phone buzzed constantly, lighting up with missed calls and unread messages. Friends, family, old flying instructors, news reporters, total strangers. But one message stood out. It was from Tom, the instructor who had guided her down. "You were made for the sky, Grace. You just didn't know it yet." She stared at the words for a long time. Then, for the first time all day, she allowed herself to cry, not out of fear, not out of pain, but from the deep, soul-shaking understanding that her life had changed forever. The following morning, Grace woke to sunlight streaming through her hotel curtains and a phone vibrating nonstop. The world outside her small, quiet room had exploded. Overnight, her story had gone global. Television anchors called her the miracle passenger. Social media turned her into a symbol of courage under pressure. People from across the globe flooded her inbox with messages. Teachers, pilots, students, mothers. Some thanked her. Some praised her. Some said her story gave them hope. Grace, however, still felt like she was catching up with reality. She turned on the TV. Nearly every news station was replaying footage of her exiting the cockpit, looking stunned and pale, being embraced by passengers. A former Navy pilot on one channel explained just how difficult it was to land that type of aircraft without formal training. "It's not just bravery," he said. "It's composure, instinct, and intelligence." What she did was exceptional. She muted the sound. Downstairs, a press team waited in the hotel lobby. A representative from the airline stood beside them with a calm but persistent smile. "They'd like to do a short interview, if you're willing," he said. Nothing invasive, just a few words. Grace agreed, reluctantly. The public already knew her name. Trying to avoid it now felt pointless. The cameras turned on. Microphones extended toward her face. The room was quiet, expectant. "I didn't wake up yesterday expecting to fly a plane," she began, her voice calm but honest. "But life doesn't always wait for us to be ready. Sometimes we're just handed a moment, and we either rise or we fall." "Were you scared?" a reporter asked. Grace looked straight at him, terrified. "And what made you step up?" She paused. "No one else did, and I had some experience. I figured if I didn't try, we'd all go down, so I tried." The room was silent for a moment, absorbing her simple answer. Then more questions followed. She answered a few, then politely excused herself, leaving behind the noise and flashbulbs. Over the next few days, Grace became a sensation. Morning shows invited her to speak. Aviation podcasts analyzed her every move. Newspapers ran headlines, like "The Passenger Who Became Pilot" and "Grace Under Pressure." People called her brave, fearless, even divine. But inside, Grace struggled with the weight of it all. She'd never been one for attention. A quiet teacher from Cincinnati. She liked routine, control, and planning. None of what had happened fit into her view of herself. She hadn't signed up to be a hero, and yet strangers treated her like one. The airline sent her a formal letter of commendation and offered her unlimited free travel for life. The mayor of her hometown invited her for a recognition ceremony. The FAA sent word that her flight hours from years ago could be considered toward fast-tracking her license if she wanted to pursue it again. For a while, Grace avoided all the spotlight. She stayed home. She resumed teaching. Her students were in awe when they found out some asked her to autograph their notebooks. Parents sent her cards. Her principal asked if she'd be interested in giving a motivational speech at the schools. Graduation. One evening, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Grace, your actions saved my life and the life of my daughter. Words can't express my gratitude. I don't believe in fate, but I believe in people. You're one of the best of us. Colin, seat 1-2. A folded drawing was included, a child's sketch of an airplane in the sky, with a smiling woman in the cockpit and hearts around her. Grace sat on the couch for a long time with that drawing in her lap, her eyes misty. 4. Once, she allowed herself to feel proud. She had done something extraordinary. Still, doubt lingered. Did she really deserve all this? Her answer came a few days later, when Tom Hadley, the flight instructor who'd guided her through the landing, reached out again. This time, in person. They met at a small airfield just outside of town. He was tall, soft-spoken, and radiated calm. As they walked down the runway, he said, "You ever think about finishing what you started?" She knew what he meant. "Honestly?" She replied, "Every day now." "Well," he said, nodding toward a small Cessna nearby, "let's take it one step further." They climbed in. The smell of fuel and sun-warmed vinyl brought back old memories. As the propeller roared to life, Grace placed her hands on the yoke with steady confidence. This time, she wasn't afraid. For the first time, flying didn't feel like surviving. It felt like coming home. 6 months had passed since that fateful flight, yet not a day went by without someone recognizing Grace Mitchell. Whether it was at the grocery store, the coffee shop, or even walking her dog, someone would inevitably stop and say, "Aren't you the woman who landed that plane?" She always smiled politely and replied, "I suppose I am." But inside, Grace had changed in more ways than most could see. The news had long moved on to other stories, and the media frenzy had faded, but Grace's life had quietly taken flight. After meeting with Tom Hadley again, she resumed flying lessons. At first, it felt surreal to sit in a cockpit with full awareness this time. No emergency, no passengers depending on her. Just sky and silence and possibility. Each lesson built her confidence. She learned not just how to fly, but why she had fallen in love with it in the first place. It wasn't about adrenaline. It was about freedom, control, trusting yourself when the world spins out of it. She studied theory, practiced emergency procedures, learned air traffic communication inside and out. No longer was she the teacher, looking to escape life's pressures by reaching for the clouds. Now she was reaching the clouds with purpose. One crisp October morning, Grace took her final flight test. As she taxied down the runway for takeoff, the familiar thrill returned not of fear, but of readiness. She'd come full circle. And when her wheels lifted off the ground, she smiled. Because she had to prove anything, but because she had already done the unthinkable. By the end of the day, she was officially a licensed private pilot. The news quietly spread. This time, it was local papers that celebrated her. Her former students sent her emails filled with emojis and GIFs. Her coworkers threw her a small party with cupcakes decorated like airplanes. It wasn't national news, but it felt better, more real. That same week, she received a letter from the FAA. She had been selected to receive the Civilian Medal of Bravery, one of the highest honors a non-military citizen could receive. The ceremony was to be held in Washington, D.C., with government officials, military personnel, and aviation leaders in attendance. At first, Grace hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted to stand in front of hundreds and be called a hero again. But then she thought about the young girl who handed her a stuffed rabbit. The man in 12C, the pilot who survived because she didn't give up. And she realized the ceremony wasn't just about her. It was about reminding the world that even ordinary people could do extraordinary things. She accepted the invitation. The Capitol building that morning gleamed beneath a cloudless sky. Inside the Grand Hall, speeches were made, hands were shaken, and her name echoed off marble columns. When it was her turn to speak, she stood behind the podium, took a deep breath, and said, "I was just a passenger until I had to become something more. And I learned that you don't need a uniform or a title to save lives. Sometimes all it takes is courage, guidance, and believing in yourself when it matters most." The applause was thunderous. After the ceremony, Grace had a quiet moment with the pilot she'd saved. Now healthy and walking again, he held her hand tightly and said, "You gave me a second chance. Thank you." She hugged him, the final piece of healing falling into place. In the weeks that followed, Grace received invitations to speak at schools and aviation academies. She accepted only a few, always returning to her teaching job and quiet life afterward. She wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing peace. But she made time to tell her story, especially to young girls who asked, "Can I be a pilot too?" She always answered, "You can be anything." On the anniversary of the incident, the airline hosted a reunion for all the passengers of Flight 426, held in a hangar decorated with string lights and banners. The evening was full of laughter, hugs, and tears. Some had kept in touch. Others were meeting again for the first time since the emergency landing. Megan, the flight attendant, gave Grace a journal with handwritten notes from every passenger. One note read, "You didn't just land us, you lifted us." That night, they toasted not to survival, but to second chances. Back home, Grace continued to fly recreationally on weekends. She bought a used Piper Cherokee, painted in soft blue and silver, and named it the Passenger. It reminded her where she started and how far she'd come. Sometimes she took friends for rides. Sometimes she flew alone, rising above the clouds in quiet reflection. But every time she reached the sky, she felt one thing above all. She belonged there. What began as a terrifying accident had become the turning point of her life. She had taken control, not just of a plane, but of her story. No longer just a teacher, no longer just a passenger. Grace Mitchell had earned her wings.